Hey there, welcome to episode 65 of the Quaggling Sand audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo. We're recording this at just about 6:30 p.m. on February 5, 2025. Happy Wednesday. Sort of. I don't know if there are happy midweeks anymore, but today we are going to speak of Crapple. You may sometimes hear this brand as Apple Computer, one of the top, top 5 most recognized brands in the world. No editorial in that title choice, to be sure. If you've never heard of the Quaggling Sand audio program, you are in the majority. Quaggling Sand is a term I coined, or a term I toined, when I was very, very young. You probably are familiar with this. It's called pins and needles by some. The return of circulation to usually a limb when you've been sitting or laying on it or otherwise made it numb. So on the return of circulation, you get that pins and needles feeling, or as I called it, quaggling sand. These are stories, tales, interesting journeys of old that I share on this, what is essentially a vanity audio essay channel or program. I don't know if I'll ever have a guest on to talk about their take on something, but who knows? If you've only just found this audio program, or maybe you've been listening the whole time, you will know. But either way, wherever you have found it, there should be an episode description that contains the show notes with a summary, which I will read to you, and the links for today's episode. Today it's only the Shameless Self-Promotion 2 links. I figure since Apple is so popular, everybody knows what Apple is already. For better or worse. So on that note, let us commence today's episode. It is later in the day. I keep recording later in the day recently. I need to get back on my normal schedule. But on that note, the summary of today's episode is thus: once upon a time, I was a huge Apple fan, eagerly waiting to get that Apple IIe, hoping someday to get a Macintosh, and eventually working as a contractor in different parts of the company, Apple, as I hoped to get a full-time job. That never did happen, by the way. Looking back and around, I'm glad it never went that far. Probably because I don't know if I would have seen Apple for what it was and is. As the title of today's episode implies, not a huge Apple fan. Kind of the opposite. The 2 shameless self-promotion links I mentioned: first, buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo. Second, Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo. You don't need to spend any money at either. You can, however, at the buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo profile page, find links to all of my audio programs, various GitHub projects, my favorite coffee beans, to which any proceeds do go. All endeavors are coffee powered and cash, but for the purposes of this discussion, coffee, buymeacoffee.com, see how that works. At the top of the profile page, there's a link to the posts section. Therein you will find a buymeacoffee.com exclusive audio program, the Buy Me an Update micro episode, 5 minutes or less, wherein I go over last week's programs and whatever's coming up for the upcoming week. I publish them on Monday mornings. I think we're on 11 or 12. I can't remember. 11 is done. So says my notes. Ko-fi.com does not enable something similar. I can do textual updates, which I do on occasion. So you will find a brief mention here or there on Ko-fi.com/DanHugo in that section of on that platform. Text updates, text posts. They enable audio linking, but they do not enable audio linking to buymeacoffee.com. Go figure. So you can check those out. These are both platforms used by content creators and open source developers and anyone who attempts to keep in touch with a fandom, a user population, a collection of people with nothing better to do, or maybe even other people. So that's why I've had them for years now. Not even getting much coffee through them, but that's fine. That's not the main goal. The main goal is to regale you with stories and tales. So let us do just that. Crapple. So the old days, I've talked about some of this previously in previous episodes. I first learned BASIC, the Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, of course, on an Atari 800 when I was in 6th grade. I was 11 years old at Horizon Elementary. Hey, Daniel, you're bored all the time. We just got some computers at the library. Why don't you go learn how to use them? And then maybe you can teach us. Then I had my first experience with a VAX, the famous digital computer corporation, I think it is. Sort of mainframe-ish computer. I guess you can call it Big Iron. The VMS, their operating system that I actually think was pretty good, but a lot of people would not agree. The VAX was in use at the Grand Canyon Community College. I was helping a blind student learning Pascal, so I would do the eyes and keyboarding to help. And in fact, keyboarding on a terminal, green screen terminal, and also on a teletype. So actually hitting keys and watching tractor paper feed through, getting responses like, edit a line and having it dump the source code, so you get the traditional tractor printer dot matrix. Yeah, good times. Very educational. After reading through all of the Computer Shopper and Byte magazines in my local library, which I've also talked about previously, I think that episode was Meet Me at the Library, I had become quite a fan of the entire Apple computer story, I guess you could say. And I would do just about anything to have access to the old Apple II, usually an Apple II Plus around this time. So this was, 82, 81, somewhere in there. So the Apple, I think it was Apple II Plus mostly, was what I was encountering or had access to. And it was pretty much the state of the art. The Apple II was still around, but I think the Apple II Plus was essentially the star of the show. And by the way, I saw one person with an IBM PC in their home. So I really didn't encounter PCs too much. I think my dad had, I don't know if they were PCs or clones. I don't know if clones were a thing back. Yeah, clones must have been coming on the scene a little bit. No. This was still early. Maybe not a clone. I cannot remember when K-Pro and Compaq did their thing. But very little experience or even visual encounters with any sort of IBM style computer. So pretty much the Apple computer product line, the Mac would come out in 1984, of course, was pretty much the thing I had access to. No Altairs, none of the classic old school stuff. I was pretty sheltered, and I never coded on a punch card. Saw them, never used them. The Apple IIe, during a summer, a neighbor of ours who was a school teacher had access to an Apple computer with 2 floppy disk drives. I think they were Reina, so individual floppy drives. They were huge, which she left at our house while she took a traditional teacher summer vacation, certainly not sitting home playing with a computer. That was what I did. So we had an Apple. I think it was a 2E, but I cannot be. I think it was a 2E, but it might have been a 2 Plus. I cannot remember. After an entire summer, I think it was between 7th and 8th grade. Must have been. Entire summer with a computer in my bedroom at all times. The choice was clear. There would be an Apple in my future, and soon. An Apple IIe, in fact. As high school commenced, our so-called 4th bedroom in the house, the family home, became the new home of our very own Apple IIe with an Apple monitor and an Apple dual floppy drive monoblock, so they were connected together. They would rest under the monitor, resting on top of the Apple IIe case. We had a CITO dot matrix printer that could get slightly better output by double striking with a tiny vertical offset, so virtually twice as many dots. I think it was a 9 pin dot matrix printhead. So you could get essentially more than 9. It wasn't perfect, but it looked pretty good. I mean, it was passable in those days before laser printing became so mainstream. And then the improvements in the competitive technologies. But there it was, an Apple computer in the home where it should have been. Hackery pokery ensued. I have mentioned these before. My pursuits of the AppleSoft basic language in those early days, not too far off from the basic on the Atari 800 computer. So I was already familiar with AppleSoft basic from using the Apple II Plus at every opportunity, including the one in the library at my junior high school. I never actually did anything with Apple Integer Basic, which was infamously built into every Apple II computer, the product of Steve Wozniak's brilliance. Like, oh, we should have an Integer Basic interpreter built in, and so it was. So I never really got to play with that. But the AppleSoft Basic, written famously by Microsoft for Apple, it was okay. I would get I learned 6502, the microprocessor in the Apple IIe and Apple II products in general. 6502 assembly language and the trapdoor that was call -151. Any old Apple nerds will know that was how you got into the monitor, the software monitor, where you could play around with assembly language. You could dump, disassemble 6502 code and all kinds of other fun stuff. So, and then I actually got a Z80 card. Z80 was an old microprocessor from Zilog on which I could run Borland Turbo Pascal, so I could revisit my Pascal days from the VAX, from the Grand Canyon Community College experience. So I did mention that it was Pascal that we were learning on the VAX. I think I did. I saved up to get a Mitsuba 1200 baud modem when Hayes came out with their legendary Hayes 2400 baud modem, and at long last I could participate in the exciting world of BBSs, those are bulletin board systems, and some minor poking around on Telnet, which was the old way you'd connect to computer networks. You would dial into a Telnet, Telenet, not Telnet. I wanted, I got it exactly backwards. Telenet, T-E-L-E, Telenet. Instead of Telnet. Telnet's a software application, kind of like a terminal program to connect to other hosts. Telenet was a way to dial in and connect to other computers on a network pre-internet days. And the occasional mystery phone number, the war dialer, was essential. If you ever saw war games, you know you could type in a prefix and it would go through and try to find modems. You just keep ringing phone numbers. And at some point I said, what if I put one phone number on 1,000 digital pagers, which I did. That was the infamous, not really, more not famous, beeper program, which caused some headaches for people, but nothing really too dramatic. I dabbled only a little bit in the joystick port of the Apple IIe, so you could interface with external devices. There were annunciators, which were basically, you could drive outputs. There was analog inputs that it supported an analog joystick, so you could input analog signals, and yeah, good times. It was a pretty simple interface, but it was the beginnings of the beginnings, if you will. Most of my hardware journey would take place in college and after, of course, but high school was essentially software only. Apple in college, that's where I really kind of, first of all, the Macintosh became the thing. My roommate Kevin had a Macintosh 2CX, which was solid. It was a solid machine. We used that thing to death for homework in the earliest days of online everything. This was pre-web internet, so we had a SLIP connection, serial link interface, or internet protocol. So you basically use a serial port to connect to an IP network. So we had a port, what was it called? Like a port server in our dorm building. So each room was connected to the fiber that was running on campus. So kind of a weird mix of leading edge and trailing edge, I suppose. But yeah, we could connect and do your basic computer stuff on the early days of internet. We could send a print job to the printer in the academic end of the campus. And what's better than that? First exposure to to AIM, to AOL, Instant Messenger, sending emails, of course, and all the other good times back in the day. There was other computers, of course, on our campus. We had J. Arthur, the Unix machine with multiple 386 processors, and of course, HMC VAX. So my return to the VAX days, just like old times. For my junior year, we had a clinic project with ESL, a division of TRW, making a new bus platform demonstration for their DR01 digital receiver superchip. That was the first time I ever had to give a technical presentation as part of our clinic project, and I was definitely not good at it. I laugh because, it was pretty bad. It was probably like the worst presentation I've ever made about anything ever. But that's how you learn. Basically, a software-defined radio in the early days of software-defined radios. We had a Macintosh 2FX for development and to make our demos work in LabVIEW and other tools. The rationale was that we should have the fastest computer possible so that we could cut down on development time. So we got a 2FX. It was supposed to be the fastest Mac available. It was not that great. I was not super impressed. It had the big Apple II chassis, not the little svelte 2CX, 2CI little box. Anyway, maybe my memories have been corrupted by the gigahertz laptops of today, but it didn't seem like it was that amazing. I finally got my own Mac, the 2CI, for my senior year in college. I put that thing to work for about 4 years, so 1 year of college and then 3 years till about 1996, and then I would eventually get exposed to Linux, and that's where everything changed. When I was at Netscape, but that's another story for another time. So working at Apple, and that's when I built my own Intel dual Pentium Pro machine, and it was over for Apple mostly. But before that, I did work at Apple. I got a job at Apple after I was laid off from Supermac. I had wanted to work at Apple, of course. I even sent Steve Jobs a letter to make sure my name was in his HyperCard stack somewhere, and someone responded. I don't think it was Steve. He's too cool for that, and not anymore, but at the time. I got a contract gig working at Apple Quality in Mariani 1 after I got laid off from my first job in Silicon Valley at Supermac. There's Macintosh everywhere. My first job at Supermac, got laid off, had a 2-week contract gig at a company doing some Apple photo editing thing. I cannot even remember the name of the company. And then on to Apple Quality in Mariani 1. It was the first official Apple computer address. If you ever looked in an Inside Macintosh book or other publications, it was their first building. So I worked in Mariani 1 testing the transition. So I did like user testing and then software application, API, application programmer interface testing. So I got to do some coding. I got to learn all about the new PowerPC Macs. These were the transition from 68K Macs of old, the Motorola 68000, 020 that was in the 2CX, the 030 that was in the 2CI, and the 040 that was the end of the line. Those were fine. 68K processors were cool at the time. So the newest and hottest thing, though, there was the Power Mac using the PowerPC 601, which was, as crazy as it sounds, a microprocessor for a home computer without a floating point unit of any kind. That caused massive problems for a while, but 603 would save the day, so would 604. And then I think everything just went away. I was only a contractor, and despite my best efforts, I was always, I would always get, that's a typo there. I said I was always. I would always get a response from my interviews when I tried to get a interview for a full-time role in one of the many groups at Apple. I'd always get the not enough experience response. Like you knew how much experience I had before I sat down. So that seemed like kind of a weak thing, but it was true. I only was 1 year out of college, if that. That's a tough one, but the times were different in the tech world back then. I mean, I had plenty of experience around technology through college and whatnot, but Apple wanted Apple stuff. Today, a person of recent college age, as I was, may have already had their own startup running some online cloud business, or who knows, developing hardware that they sold on Kickstarter. So the experience that people have access to at a younger age would have been a game changer back then. But at the time, it was 1994. I didn't have 10 years doing, well, technically I did, but not relevant experience, I guess. I would end my contracting days at Apple with a 6-month gig in the Newton Group, working on the C++ SDK software developer kit. So you could write C++ code on the Newton, mostly for driver development, but for anything you didn't want to use Newton script for also. I learned more about a lot of things. By the way, Newton script was essentially not a precursor, but definitely a cousin of JavaScript today. And in fact, when I've mentioned this before, I sat like I initially shared a big giant cube with Brendan Eich of JavaScript fame. And I said, this looks like Newton script. And he said, that's pretty good observation. They're both based on self, which I knew that. I knew that fact. So my first bit of knowledge that I could bring into the future was my familiarity with Newton script. And there you go. So I learned a lot of things about a lot of things in those 6 months, though. Probably more than I had in any 6-month window of time up until then. Now, this was 1995. I think it was 1995 when I'd wrapped up my Newton experience. And ultimately, though, it was quite worthwhile. I don't know looking back if I would have done it again. I'm not really sure, but it was the end of my Apple fandom. I'd kind of had enough of the way Apple did things. Although I did interview there one other time when I was living in Arizona as a vehicle to move back to Silicon Valley, but I'm pretty sure I'm glad that didn't work out. So wait, what about UMax? I did work at UMax after. I did take a job at UMax Computer Corp, which was making Macintosh clones at the time. This was in about 1996, 97. Was it in there somewhere? And this was after I'd worked at TrueVision on their Target 2000 video capture product, where the new bus version for the Mac, the new bus Macs, Power Macs, were pretty solid for video editing, and the Target 2000 for new bus Macs was pretty much their top tier product. So if you were doing prosumer video editing of any kind, it was going to be on a Macintosh. Now, it may have been on an 840 AV, which was a 68040 Macintosh computer, not PowerPC, but they implemented the Texas Instruments specified new bus interface, so it actually worked. That I'll get into towards the end of today's episode. So the PowerPC, though, was a real thing by this point. UMax was building the future with a chirp prep PPC product, that is CHRP, Common Hardware Reference Platform, or PREP, PowerPC Reference Platform, or PPCP, PowerPC Platform. So power and then PC and then platform, PPCP. They were building that product, which meant I could use all of my hardware and embedded systems experience, along with my shift in interest from Mac OS to Linux, not to mention my interest in the inner workings of the PowerPC microprocessor itself that I had only just touched on with the 601 back in the day. Now we were up to the 603 and the 604. 604 was the GoldenEye, would be the killer processor that was going to set the tone for desktop, and that's when the Pentium 2 came out, and then PowerPC was what was that thing again? What? Huh? And then Apple would switch over to Intel anyway. UMax was one of the most educational times in my entire career, as it turns out, given the number of facets of the entire tech stack I was exposed to and interacted with. I did firmware development, not only for PowerPC, but for Intel BIOS. I did we were building motherboards from the ground up. So we were designing them and building them and debugging them and power on or bring up. So the first time you plug in a new hardware device, you make sure it doesn't blow up or melt anything or start burning. cross-platform standards, like how do you make a Super I/O work on a Mac? How do you get ISA slots to work on a Mac? All kinds of other stuff. I learned, well, I already knew Forth, but I learned how Forth worked in open firmware so that we could boot up the Mac and then drop into open firmware. I was doing the RTAS component, the Runtime Abstraction Services layer, which was similar to BIOS interrupt routines. And can you hear that? Emergency vehicle. Production by a street. So I don't know if you can hear that, but definitely I could. So yeah, and I got to be a part of the early days of Linux PPC. So I had Linux PPC running on my old, at this point, Macintosh 2CI to do, no, not 2CI. I was running it, that's not a Power Mac, on my old 7500. So I had a Power Mac 7500, which was probably the best case I've ever had to deal with from Apple, the enclosure for the computer. 7500 running Linux PPC. It was because I had Linux PPC running not only on my Macintosh Power Mac 7500 to do our network address translation for our new DSL connection at home. So we had one of the first 50 DSL connections in Sunnyvale, some minor infamy there, I suppose. But I had Linux PPC running on my S900, which was a Power Mac clone that Umax was making. So one day we got a software drop from Apple for our clone, our PPCP clone that we were building. And it didn't work. It couldn't build. So I wasn't in his group yet, but I was, I get this comment like, I can't build this thing. And I was looking at it and I said, this is a GNU make file. It's using GCC to build. And I said, I have all these tools on my Linux PPC machine in my cube down the hallway here. So I got the old, can you build this? And I did. More emergency vehicles. And I hey, do you want to be in the firmware group? And I said, yeah, sure. So that's how that worked. So I built the firmware image. We started doing open firmware debugging and stuff so we could get the machine up to the point where it was about to boot an operating system. And that's where we spent a tremendous amount of time. And I learned a tremendous amount about debugging code and about logic analyzers interfacing with PowerPC bus cycles and PCI and cache protocols. Good times. And we were building a multiprocessor board, so we had to deal with cache coherence. We had to deal with, what's it called? What is it called? It's modified, invalid. I cannot remember. Modified, invalid, flush? No, invalid. Modified, invalid, shared, exclusive. Modified, exclusive, shared, invalid. Something like that. So, yeah, we had cache bits and cache snoops and all this stuff. So lots and lots and lots of education, not to mention the ups and downs of a small company pursuing big things. Like I said, I just changed groups because somebody said, do you want to be in my group? Yeah, sure. That's about all it took. But yet we were doing pretty high risk development, which eventually didn't go well because Apple pulled their cloning plans. So messy. It was MESI is the abbreviation. So modified, exclusive, shared, invalid, MESI. Anyway, the trials and tribulations of a small company that's doing hardware development. Hardware is hard. I learned the joys of Net 90 or something, whatever their payment terms were. When Apple decided to cancel clones, they gave Power Computing and Umax Computing like enough time to sell through inventory. And in order to sell through inventory, we needed I can't remember if it was Grand Central. There was an Apple part that made it a Macintosh compatible computer that you had to buy from Apple exclusively. And because Umax was all paid up and didn't piss them off, Steve Jobs at the time, I think, was back. Yeah, that sounds right. So he decided to cancel clones, right? So we can sell through our inventory, but we're going to need those parts. And I think it was Grand Central. It was either O'Hare or Grand Central, but the naming scheme. Power computing, however, had somehow irked Apple. So power computing did not have access to anything, or they were not able to sell through their inventory or whatever it was. So UMax was able to stay afloat long enough to switch over to Intel clones, well, Intel designs. We were right down the street from the R&B building where I would eventually go and work many, many, many years later. And then we had our FAE, Eric Sindelar, who I'm connected to on LinkedIn. And we had first access to Pentium 2 microprocessors. If you are familiar with AGP, we had, for some reason, a bug that made AGP run at 100 megahertz instead of 2x PCI at 33, so 66 megahertz. So at the time, 100 megahertz, that was like blazing fast for graphic cards and whatnot. So yeah, tons and tons and tons of education, not to mention the fact that we were across the street from Great America in Santa Clara, very essentially where the 49ers stadium is now in Santa Clara. So we had a lot of lunchtime spent at Great America riding Top Gun and Drop Zone. That was a good time too. So we have reached the end. My interest at UMax was all about the CHIRP, the Common Hardware Reference Platform, which was to enable user choice with support for multiple operating systems, including Solaris PowerPC, Windows NT PowerPC, obviously Mac OS PowerPC, and then Linux PowerPC, and the list goes on, whatever you wanted. Today, this is not so outlandish to be able to run what you want on your, what is now kind of an open platform almost from Intel. I mean, it's essentially open. It's not so outlandish to think this. At the time, it was a crazy notion, though. Like, wait, you want to be able to run something other than Mac OS? Some of the people there at UMax, including my manager, for most of the time, he would get laid off, and I was not laid off, were hardcore Apple fans. They were all Apple employees formerly. I was much more of a Linux convert at this point, and even though I started out, when I moved to Silicon Valley, I was all into Apple. I was nowhere near as much a fan, and then once I worked there, I kind of realized, looking back, I think the Apple culture, the actual on-campus Apple environment, and Apple products, especially today, are not nearly so healthy for the world as people might believe. Too much elitism, too much NIH or not invented here. Like, we got to do it ourselves. Going our own way thinking, which was reinforcing that elitism. Like, well, the Apple way is not going to work with the other ways that everybody else in the world is using. So you got to buy Apple. You got to be, Apple loyalist. The color of our text message bubbles is better than yours, et cetera, et cetera. All this is a cultural elitist attitude, which is not really in keeping with the way computers really should work, which is to interoperate. And of course, real issues with paranoia and prying into privacy. The corporate culture at Apple was very suspicious of everyone. Rightfully so sometimes, because there were some characters that worked there. Infamously, people in the janitorial staff were stealing computers and smuggling them out in the trash bags, like in the big giant bin that they would roll out. Occasionally employees would a little corporate espionage. Famously, if you lied on your resume, Apple would fire you immediately. Like, they'd escort you out. If you were in the middle of biting a sandwich, like, you're out. So, not a perfect place, but that's a fraction of the population is going to be like that. But Apple was just never for everybody, even though they said they were. I don't know. It's kind of hard to describe, except to say that after I worked there, I lost my fandom. And once I found out also that they would totally spy on their employees. They knew exactly when you were coming and going. They had access to all of your emails, of course, and they would actually read through them. So, that's the nature of being an employee at a company, but very distrustful, even though it's supposed to be a big, big happy place. So in hindsight, I was glad that I was never completely roped into all of that. Today, I would never consciously give money to Apple for anything. And I became slightly perturbed, or I become slightly perturbed, and I have become slightly perturbed whenever anyone suggests that non-Apple fans are in some way less than. Like, oh, you're using an Android, oh, you're using you're a Windows person. While at UMax, I advocated for user choice. That was, with cross-platform, open standards, and open, maybe even closed-source software that could interoperate and could run in your different environments and so on. I actually, during my sort of lunchtime interview conversation with the guy who would become my manager, and again, I was not working for him when they hired me. He just was one of the people who talked to me. Man, can you hear that too? Emergency vehicles going nuts tonight. So we had a very long lunch, and we actually got into a minor argument. Production by street. I can see the various emergency vehicle lights in the distance there. So we actually had a minor argument about, like, Mac OS is the best. And I said, I don't care. I'm more interested in computing and computers as tools, not religion. Right? I should be able to use Linux on a machine and not have everybody get upset or angry at me for using the wrong software and so on. So he was much more of an Apple zealot, but he had worked there for forever. I just never became that much of a tribalist in the operating system or even computer realm in general. I was more into the computers and the tech, not the being a part of something that was anti-other parts. So the tribalism was so prevalent, though, at the time, and it was something of an anachronism, really, when you think about it. I mean, tabs and spaces, Macs versus PCs, Intel versus little endian versus big endian, all this stuff. That's the ordering of bytes within a larger multi-byte word. So while I'm 100% Linux today, I don't think ill of anyone using Windows or Mac or an iPhone or whatever. I'm an Android user also, which I don't like, and I'm kind of tired of Android, but it is what it is. That's another story, though. I don't know anything about these other platforms, to be honest, so I can't really help with the tech stuff. If somebody asks me a question about their Mac or their Windows machine, I'm like, I haven't even touched a Mac in like 6 years, I think, and Windows very, very rarely. I just don't know. iPhone, I don't know the last time I touched an iPhone device. So you do the tool, because you know what? Use the tools that work for you. If you want to use a Mac, if you want to use an iPhone, that's fine. But I don't use those, so I cannot help you. And I'm not familiar. I don't know the latest of this or that. So I don't know anything about these other platforms. So I'm kind of, I'll say apathetic, I guess. Like I said, use what you want, use what makes you productive, use what works for you, etc. We should be using technology to do things, not to feel better than other people. The take home from UMax and the leave it there from Apple. Haha. So yeah, there you go. I was a huge Apple fan going into Silicon Valley, and it took 3 years for me to completely to reach a point of contempt, pretty much complete contempt. I did interview there. Like I said, I was living in Phoenix and I was looking to move back to Silicon Valley. So I did interview there in probably 2003 or so. It was a former UMax colleague. They flew me up. I had an interview. I went home and I never heard from anyone again. And that was a good preparation for Vegas. Ghosting culture. I would later hear that person had somehow gotten in trouble for something, and maybe he was on his way out from Apple or whatever. Who knows? Who cares? The good old days. But I am very glad that I never did become an Apple employee, because I probably would have gotten the wrong idea about Apple. I probably would have been so engrossed, like, hey, I finally got my job at Apple. Of course Apple is right. Of course the Apple way is the best way. Of course we should be spying on all of our employees. Of course we should be pursuing questionable user privacy practices. Oh, but we're going to keep the FBI from hacking into our phones. We can do it, but not law enforcement. I'm not going to argue either way on that. That's a totally different mindset. But this notion of Apple pretending to protect user privacy, but actually some questionable practices and the mindset of inside Apple, I think, is just a little off. And I've never worked for Tim Cook. I don't know anything about Tim Cook other than Apple itself has a decades-long culture of just being a little off. And I'm much more a fan, like the M4 or the M series of processors when they switch to ARM. Now, I will give Apple credit. They switched from the 6502 to the 68000 to the PowerPC to Intel processors and now to their own ARM-based M series and then the A series in the iPhones. So points for keeping something of a coherent user experience across so many processor changes. The x86 instruction set is also an anachronism. So good on them for keeping sort of current. They are performant, but they're not open source, such that getting Linux running on them was a kind of a pain. Apparently, never tried myself. I'm much more inclined to be interested in the RISC-V platform, which is an open hardware standard or an open hardware design, I suppose, for a microprocessor into the future. So we'll see how that goes. I'm much more interested in what Framework is doing with their modular laptops that you can sort of mix and match and you can upgrade components. They actually have a RISC-V motherboard that you can put in there and have a RISC-V laptop or switch back into your x86. I believe they do have AMD and Intel processors, and the list goes on. So all kinds of stuff going on there. We need mobile phones that are open like that. The Apple mindset is closed. And I should say it's the Steve Jobs variation. If Wozniak had control of the company, he was Apple II. He was open, take the cover off, put cards in, get your soldering iron out, hack on things, learn how stuff works. So he was much more open-minded and open systems-minded. Steve Jobs was much more about you'll get the computer I give you and like it. And I don't think that's the right mindset. So anyway, that's my Apple journey. I'm glad I got off early and moved on to other platforms, got much more into hardware, much more into open source software and so on, and that's where I am today. So there you go. Oh, sorry about that pop there. I got to edit that out. That's all my Apple story for today. There are other parts of it I'm sure that I'll fill in future episodes. Thanks for listening as always. Take care.